Hello, everybody. My name is Emmanuel Garamon. I'm the Chief Security Officer for the Hytema Corporation for the country of New Zealand, and I'm here today to give my expert testimony in cybersecurity. I have a strong background in cybersecurity fundamentals and prevention, and I'm here today to answer some questions to help clarify the cyber issues that happened. So today I'm here to present the compilation report out for the 3 projects that we went over together as a team. I will also answer the questions that are asked of me from the court in regards to the testimony, and then I will discuss my decisions that I made during my events as Chief Security Officer. So for the first project, we started to develop a team of cyber professionals for the country of New Zealand. We also collaborated with the other 4 countries that are a part of this Five Eyes Alliance. Those countries were to include the US, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, and of course New Zealand themselves. The goal was to develop a somewhat global cyber prevention program that all the countries can agree and collaborate on, and this would hope to make a preventative measures for multiple countries to better protect themselves from cyber attacks. So we researched countries' international law policies to make sure there weren't any inconsistencies or issues that would reflect one law in one country or in the other. We created a cyber policy matrix. This matrix helped us to better understand the different issues that arise within the country, and it covered a wide array of topics such as social security, personal security, legal practices, human resources. All of these categories we had to take into account and see how they would get affected in order to properly create a cyber policy matrix. We also continued to determine some bad actors. So with a list of IPs, our cybersecurity team was able to uncover certain foreign traffic and actually pinpoint that to a geographical location. With that geographical location, we were able to find out what countries were being involved from these attacks. With those IPs, we were able to actually conduct these vulnerability scans through Wireshark, and by tracking the traffic, we were able to see how much of that traffic from those specific countries was actually malicious. Finally, we created a network security checklist. This checklist helped us be able to understand what type of parameters and regulations and policies we needed in place in order to have an effective cyber defense method. So this was the main scope of what we did for our first project. So for the second project, we started to actually determine what attack vectors were harming our systems and where these sources were coming from. In order to identify these attack vectors, we had to use a Wireshark software, which helps us actually monitor traffic as it enters and exits our system. So by doing that, we're able to see where these sources are coming from, and usually we can trace that via an IP. Once we were able to match the IP to its source, we were able to see, where this was coming from. By also using Wireshark, we're able to actually track and see what protocols or websites they are actually targeting. So if they're tracking something like port 80, which is HTTP, we know that they are trying to attack web traffic. And then sometimes you're able to actually see in the info list what website they're trying to attack. In this case, we saw several HTTP packets being sent, and it was coming from an unknown IP. And from that unknown IP, they were trying to attack our WordPress server. This WordPress server contains a lot of sensitive information that can contain, passwords, accounts, things like that. So it was definitely a vulnerability that our team was able to uncover. By doing the vulnerability assessment, we were actually able to scan the network and see how much traffic was being sent to a specific IP. Usually what systems like to do, attackers, they like to overflow a system by sending multiple tons and tons of packets to one specific IP. And by doing that, they, in essence, overflow that server, and then that sometimes causes the system to crash. So when we were able to find these vulnerabilities, we started to develop best practice countermeasures by writing out policies, plans, and procedures for how we are going to attack this threat and how we're going to prevent this from happening again. We also created an effective incident response plan. So once we discovered the threat, we had to lay out a plan for how we go about taking care of this. So when it happens again, there's a much smoother transition on how we go about the process from identifying to actually removing the threat. As discussed earlier, we actually monitor the specific traffic, and these were, again, HTTP GET requests, which usually have something to do with a distributed denial of service attack. So by further analyzing these packets in depth, we're able to learn more about how to combat cybercrime in the future in regards to these specific attacks. But by analyzing these packets, we're able to understand the red flags a lot better. So those were the bulks of what we did for the second project. And yes, we will go talk about the final project now. So for the final project, we did a more offensive approach where we actually discovered a possible threat on our system that had to deal with a ransomware attack. And we had to develop SITREP reports that would help explain what happened and how we dealt with the process. So in this, we noticed a possible ransomware attack on an employee, and this employee was claiming to be essentially blackmailed and that her system was compromised by a foreign source. So we had to go through and investigate and discover whether our employee was actually necessarily lying or was she telling the truth. But we were able to discover that by doing a more in-depth research on what was happening. So by tracking the account, tracking their activity, tracking if there's any foreign IPs coming from an unknown computer, we go about that process and develop a plan for how we target it. So we had to analyze the supply chain risks. So we had to look down the line of where information is transferring to see where the system is being harmful. Was it a personal security issue? Was this actually just a user error? Was this a vulnerability on our actual system? These type of things, we had to go down the line and see where the weakness began, and then basically retrace our steps to understand what we could have done better. By doing that, we also made the software development matrix, which actually helped us decide which method was going to be best to mitigate this threat and actually come with a solution. We also had to have a business continuity plan. So this plan would actually help us explain if something happens, if there's a server that crashes or systems go down, do we have a strategy to help keep the business going? And then how is it going to look, for the press and for customers? How will we ensure them that their systems are safe, even though an attack did happen? That kind of a cushion is what customers need and what everyone would like to have. So by doing that, we were able to pin down that it was a possible ransomware attack. So we actually had our cybersecurity team conduct a ransomware lab simulation on a virtual machine. By doing this, we were able to, match behaviors that were happening on our system along with what we were practicing to see if this really was a ransomware attack or not. And it turned out that it was somewhat of a ransom attack. By doing that, we were actually able to practice hacking into the server, and from that server, we were able to download a long list of information, and it went by in steps. So first, we were able to uncover a script. That script had a password. That password, we were able to then decrypt, and from that password that we decrypted, we were able to input it into a separate system, and we were able to get more information. So this is something that our team can do. So we know that there are cyber criminals out there that can also do this. So this is important to know that these vulnerabilities exist, and we have to try and figure out how to mitigate them. So by conducting all those findings, we were able to make a mitigation report, and this mitigation report would plan out how we would dissolve of this ransomware attack, whether that be with a honeypot or with some more intrusion prevention systems. And then from that report, we give it to our higher ups so they feel more confident about the strength and quality of our system for the future. So I was given a series of questions from the legal team, to give my expert opinion on how I go about these questions. So for the first question, it asks, what are the legal challenges associated with the cyber incidents involving foreign countries and how they could affect e-discovery? So as you know, with e-discovery is essentially the electronic aspect of identifying and collecting electronically stored information in response to requests for production of a lawsuit or investigation. So how we obtain information from electronic system and properly put it in a legal suit. So the legal challenge associated with cyber incidents is that every country has their own set of rules and methods for how they go about crime, whether it's cybercrime, any type of crime. Different countries have different policies. Also, certain laws are illegal and legal in different countries. So it's important to know that before you go about actually saying something's illegal or attacking a country, you need to make sure that it's even illegal in the country to begin with. One thing. Also, when you're dealing with cyber incidents, it's important to know that you have to be able to understand and know who the enemy is and if they're a clear, definitive enemy. That's the number one thing. So in our previous project, when we were tracking attacks from, IP traffic from Russia and from China, we had to make sure that these weren't just, reconnaissance pings and they were actual malicious targets. So being able to understand and 100% confirm with the cybersecurity team that these were malicious acts are the first thing, and that's the main challenge when facing cyber incidents. For the second question, what are the legal challenges of assessing and retrieving electronic evidence stored on foreign soil? So with this goes kind of hand in hand with the first question. When you're trying to actually obtain legal evidence, it's important to understand the proper chain of custody in that country and how you're going to obtain that evidence. So these challenges always arise between countries because one country, the host nation, feels like they deserve all the main evidence and they don't necessarily want to give it away. You see this in just departments throughout one country, FBI, CIA. Sometimes they don't want to talk, or the cops don't want to talk to FBI, things like that. So imagine this on a more global scale between two country departments from two different countries. They're not going to want to share information because they feel like it could cause a security incident or a risk of national security of exposing information. So that's a big challenge, and it's important to have a proper legal team, and it's important to have that clear communication of what exactly you're trying to do to help the country solve their cybercrime, and know exactly written out what you're going to touch, what systems you're going to infiltrate. So being able to know exactly what you can attack and what you can actually investigate, and having that clear communication is going to be easier for both countries involved in the suit that's going on. So my team and I went through a series of rounds where we were engaged in several cyber incidents, and we had to make a series of decisions and adapt in real time and see how we actually would go about these decisions. There were 3 separate rounds, and each of us were involved in separate categories, but in regards to my expert testimony as Chief Security Officer, I will be talking about my categories that I discussed and the decisions I took. On the picture here, you can see the different rounds and the decisions that I made, if changed any, throughout. So the 8 topics I talked about was antivirus policy, authentication, data encryption, DNS redundancy, firewall, IDPS, physical security, and remote access policy. So with antivirus policy, the first thing we did was talk about the quality of antivirus solution used. So, of course, being a cybersecurity professional, I want the strongest antivirus possible. Granted, as long as it's feasible and actually affordable enough. Thankfully, we had enough funding to actually fund the strongest antivirus. So every round, I decided to go with the strongest. Frequency of scans, I started the first 2 rounds by doing it once daily, but I realized multiple times per day will be the most effective option, because definitely not weekly, but once daily. If you do your scan in the morning, catch nothing. Maybe the cyber awareness or the cyber attack happens later in the day, and since you didn't conduct any more scans, you missed it, and then the next day you're already way behind on the damage that could have occurred. Frequency of patch updates. I started first to decide only for critical updates, but then I realized, in my opinion, patches are always critical because you never know what they could fix or what could actually happen to a system if that one little patch isn't fixed. So I finished the final round with always releasing a patch when it's done. So that talks about antivirus. For authentication, Kerberos server spending. So in order to have a proper effective server, I was putting funding more towards starting on the cheaper side, but once I noticed that we had more funding, I started to put the maximum amount of funding I was allowed, which was $400,000. The key distribution center spending, also wanted to go with the highest amount. I started giving a little by little because I wanted to make sure the rest of my team had enough funding. But once I started getting to the final round and saw that we had enough, I went with the maximum amount once again. Why not? Data encryption. All 3 rounds, I decided to go with file encryption. It was either file encryption or I believe it was a drive. I like encrypting a drive, but to me, file encryption is a more, I guess, tedious, but also a more secure because you are encrypting every specific file. If you encrypt a drive and then let's say a user accidentally takes a file out of the drive, that file isn't necessarily encrypted, but the drive still is. So when you're transmitting that file between another party, they might forget to encrypt it. But if each file is encrypted, they will automatically get the notification to encrypt that file in an email. In regards to the strengthened bits, 128 bits across the board, that's the highest I was allowed to do. I'd probably go with 256, but 128 is more than enough of bit rate in order to get a strong encryption algorithm. DNS redundancy goes without saying. You want redundancy in your domain name systems. So I just went with yes all across the board. Redundancy is key in anywhere on a network. You want system faults. You want to be able to have, if something fails, you want to be able to have a backup of it. That goes for drives, that goes for computers, that goes for account passwords, that goes for a lot of different things. Split DNS topology. Definitely went with yes all across the board. You want to keep information throughout the company separate, so if a server crashes, you don't lose everything. Also, there's no reason to have information from different departments all in one giant server. You want that kind of separate. Filtering, strictness in regards to the firewall now. Started with medium high because I know firewalls can become a pain if they're literally filtering out sometimes actual traffic that needs to get through. It's just the firewall being extra secure. But then I went with high because given the past of attacks and the activity that has been happening, the highest filtering is what I decided to go with in order to prevent unwanted traffic from entering. IDPS, the detection and prevention systems. So the type to employ, I decided to go with the network-based all across the board. Host-based is good, but you want the detection systems throughout the network, not just on the specific computers, because if the computer gets thrown out or changed, now you have to reinstall that intrusion detection on that specific host. And there's a lot more hosts than there is a network, so that's also probably more expensive and more tedious and not as effective, really. The class of honeypot to deploy, or research honeypot. This allows a cybersecurity team to effectively monitor their honeypot network and see what type of criminal activities are being engaged and what vulnerabilities these cyber criminals are looking for. So that's kind of the strength of the honeypot we wanted to go with. For physical security, isolate rooms containing infrastructure, absolutely restricted access. Server rooms are always restricted to specific personnel, so they'll be probably badge enabled and only the proper personnel will be allowed in there. Physical access through the role-based access control, limited access, of course. You only give employees what they need and nothing more, nothing less. That's just how it should be going about, and that's how we're going to do it. Degree of access given to visitors. Always accompanied limited access. Visitors will always be escorted with a actually vetted personnel. So that's how visitors will be able to get through. And of course, they will not be allowed to go throughout any room specifically. Violation penalties. First, start with suspensions. If it escalates to a more severe and issue, then possible termination, but suspensions will be first form of punishment. For remote access policy, who is able to remotely access our system? Usually only system admins, but in case of emergencies, we'll go ahead and let upper management first, but then I ended with executive only. Should only be high ups that really need to access important information for the company, and that's on a case-by-case basis, and they will still need approval from the security team. Their privileges, read and write, I guess whatever they need to effectively finish their job, but they will be monitored. And violation penalties. Started with suspensions, but that's starting to be tampering of a network, so that is kind of grounds for termination, of course, conducting an investigation. So these are the decisions I decided to go with for each round, and round 3 will be my final decisions for all of them, as you can see here. Let me know if there are any other questions you need, but if there are anything else, that is my cross testimony video, and thank you for all of your patience, and I appreciate it.